Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah.
Are you good as back? Great. So I want to begin by thanking you all for coming here. We're really excited and honored to host this event. We think it's a really important topic. We're looking forward to the conversation that's about to happen. I next want to thank the organizers. There's a lot of people that really work together, a lot of flexibility, a lot of last-minute changes to make this event possible. And we're really indebted to the organizers who have just done really a phenomenal job. Before we get into the talk, I want to lay out this is the structure of what tonight's going to be. We're going to begin with a brief talk by Daniel, followed by a talk by Nour, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So the goal is really that most of tonight is going to be a two-way dialogue. We want to have the opportunity for all of you to ask as many questions as you have, to engage with the speakers. But in light of that, we request that while they're speaking, to hold out your questions until the end. Does that seem fair? Yeah. Great. I want to begin now by introducing Daniel. Daniel was born in Texas. He then attended Harvard, where he majored in physics and minored in philosophy. He then did a master's in philosophy at Tufts. Part-time, he studied traditional Islamic sciences. He is the founder of the Muslim Skeptic. And more than that, I want to share a brief story just about my personal relationship with Daniel and why I'm personally so excited to have him here. I remember when I was in college, I think it was my third year of college when I was a junior, a friend of mine, a really close friend of mine, who normally doesn't really say much to me, he said, "Hey, you have to really check out this guy, Daniel Haqiqatjou." And I thought, okay, that's great. Let me look into this. And I started reading his stuff. I started listening to his podcast, and it was really just a turning point in my life trajectory. I think Daniel is very rational. He has a really brilliant approach to discourse, to reason, to really breaking down and presenting arguments in an amazing way. And I think you all are going to, inshallah, benefit from that. Nour is our other speaker, and so she'll be speaking after Daniel. I'm going to do the introduction to them right now. 1 second. Nour Goda is an Arab-American Muslim revert who spent a decade identifying as an atheist. Her return to Islam several years ago was catalyzed a deep dive in self-reflection and a commitment to understanding how competing ideologies play out within the Western Muslim community. In 2015, Nour launched a blog and a podcast called Between Arabs. The podcast addressed social taboos and stigmas within the Arab and Muslim communities, wherein Nour interviewed and spoke with leading Muslim figures such as Daniel Haqiqatjou, and others about racism, sexuality, feminism, and other sensitive matters. She recently chose to discontinue the project in order to reestablish and clarify her position on such issues. Nour is a graduate of Connecticut College, where she studied English and religious studies. She also holds an MS in English education as a Montessori school administrator. Her passion for the art of language, coupled with her knowledge and experience as an educator, inform her understanding of secular, social, political narratives and tactics, which distort the thinking of many Muslim millennials today. Nour has spoken on several podcasts, including The Madden of Luke's, Becoming the Alpha Muslim, and 70% Halal. Her piece, Did Western Feminism Trigger My Failed Muslim Marriage, can be found on Muslim. So again, we're really excited about these two speakers. We think it's an amazing opportunity. And join me in welcoming these two speakers.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Jazakallah khair for that generous introduction, and thank you for inviting myself and Nour here for this, what I hope to be an enlightening and eye-opening discussion on feminism. The theme of what I'm going to discuss with you is the dangers of feminism, and in a nutshell, why feminism is problematic and bad, not only for Muslims, but also non-Muslims. And I know that many of you have maybe heard online that I'm an evil misogynist, women hater, and all kinds of other very nasty things that people have been saying about me online, but I hope that what I can show you is a very reasonable, even-headed approach to feminism that's grounded in the Islamic paradigm, the Islamic worldview. And I also want to note on this issue of bullying, because it seems that anyone who expresses any kind of divergent opinion from the status quo and the increasingly extreme perspective on feminism publicly gets castigated, gets shouted down, has events canceled. And I think this is a big problem. I think that especially within the Muslim community and within the Muslim context, we should be able to have reasonable dialogue. And I invite anyone here to, in the Q&A, challenge me, question Nour, and we can have a productive conversation. The first thing I want to do is dispense with this rather silly idea that only women can discuss feminism. And so this is another criticism that has been raised, that I, as a man, how dare Daniel speak about feminism? What right does Daniel have to speak about feminism? And usually we don't have this perspective. We don't say that only communists can discuss communism. Only Nazis can discuss fascism. No, we don't have that kind of perspective with any other ideology. And furthermore, so much of feminism is directed toward implicating and criticizing men, and men individually and collectively. So isn't it just that men should be able to defend themselves and be able to say and respond to these critiques? Isn't it only fair? Even criminals are due a trial, a fair trial, and have a defense where they can defend themselves against accusations. So if men are truly the criminals and have been the instigators of so much patriarchy and oppression and subjugation of women, then shouldn't men have the chance to respond and to give counterclaims and to give a counter perspective? I think that is only fair. There's another misconception that I want to clear up, which is that if you oppose feminism, that means that you are against women's rights and that you only care about trampling women's rights. But this is a mistake. I think that I come from a background where I considered myself a feminist at one point in time, back when I was in high school and even early in college. And I considered myself to be a proud Muslim feminist. And it was only after reading, researching, speaking with others who are familiar with the intellectual history of feminism and the sordid history of feminism that I began to see that, okay, actually feminism has these big problems. And not only is feminism not conducive to women's rights, it actively opposes women's rights. And so this is what I want to convince you of today in my talk. But I just want to make clear that I do not oppose women's rights in any shape or form. It's just a question of what women's rights entails. And I think what a lot of Muslim women especially feel, and even women around the world and in America, is that they have faced instances of oppression or abuse, domestically or otherwise, and they find within feminism a language to express their grievances. And so feminism seems like an opportune outlet in order to protest and object to abuse and bad practices. And I can certainly understand this. When we look at the Muslim world, in many countries, there are practices that are vile, that are disgusting, that are completely contrary to any ethic, Islamic or otherwise. You find, even within this country, and this is something that I have personally experienced, of abusive fathers, abusive husbands who will mistreat their daughters or will mistreat their wives. They will prevent them from, basic sustenance and provision for living their lives, preventing their mobility, preventing them from seeing family, These are things that we find in certain Muslim cultures, and we need to address that, but we need to address that from an Islamic perspective. Okay, it might seem that feminism is the only solution that provides answers to this kind of abuse and mistreatment, but that's patently false. If we look at the writing of scholars and classical ulama in the past, they address very clearly the rights of women, the rights of the wife, the rights of the daughter, okay, the rights of the mother, okay, and that is how it's conceived. You know, women have these rights depending on their role within the family. And so we do not need to appeal to modern feminist thought in order to address these issues. And once I give you some idea of feminism's intellectual history, my hope is that you'll also cringe at the thought of appealing to feminism in trying to justify women's rights. Because as I mentioned, it's quite a sordid history. And so the question that we can ask here is, does feminism support women's rights? And again, my contention is that feminism obstructs women's rights and men's rights and human rights in big ways as well as small ways. And the overall point that I want to underline for you is that when we look at the history of feminism, it has been a destructive force within human society and a destructive force within human history. Not only that, it has been a tool specifically wielded against Muslim societies. In colonialism, it has been a tool wielded against Native Americans, Africans, Black Americans, Aboriginals in Australia, to further genocide and the stealing of land. And feminism has a very clear, direct history and involvement with all of these colonial, imperialistic, and genocidal practices. But to understand the danger and truly appreciate the threat that feminism poses, we have to take a step back and understand the state of our modern society. We have to take a step back and understand the nation state, okay? Because the nation state as a structure for organizing human life, you know, nation as in, we have countries, we have the United States of America, you have the UK, France, and so forth. The nation state structure is something that's new within human history. Its history does not go back further than 200, 300 years. And when we look at the way that nation states structure society, you look at economic authority, political authority, education, childcare, elder care, health care, socialization, socializing, entertainment. All of these human functions proceed through structures of the state, okay? Structures of the state and also corporate structures, meaning all of economic power today is found within corporate entities or state entities. Political authority, similarly. Education, you have state schools. Childcare, you have corporate daycare. Elder care is run through nursing homes. Socialization in public places. Again, all of that happens in the state or corporate context. And this means that power within society, the power to control and to condition human beings, is largely in the hands of the state. Okay? Government power, corporate power. Okay? And if you understand this and just reflect on your own lives, that's something that is undeniable. If you look at the average family, right? How much time does the average child spend in daycare versus with their parents? How much time does the average child from the age of kindergarten all the way until 12th grade and then college, how much average time is that child with the parents as opposed to within technically a state or corporate institution, which is public schooling, private schooling? Okay? So the child is 40 hours in that context. And then even outside of that, coming home from school, how much time is spent with the parents? Again, within the family context. Okay, even for things like entertainment, children and adults as well will go outside of the family context and engage in consumer practices and go to malls, movie theaters, and so on and so forth. So when we look at our lives and how much, just from the perspective of time that's spent, so much of it is spent being in that state and corporate context. And so as a child, you're born, if both of your parents work, which is increasingly common, or if you're born to a single mother, you're put into daycare, you start your life institutionalized, and then as you get old, you retire, you can't take care of yourself, you're institutionalized again, and you're put into elder care. From beginning to your life to the end of your life, you are within that context. And this is just a function of the modern state. It's not something that is capitalist or communist or socialist. All modern nation states have these features, and there are some superficial differences in that basic point across different political, socioeconomic systems. But it's something that's just a characteristic and a basic feature of the modern nation state. But what is the Islamic vision for human society? And here we notice a big contrast when we look at the history. You can look at it from an academic, secular perspective, or you can look at it from an Islamic perspective. There's major differences. There's major differences in the way that society was structured prior to the modern nation state, and specifically within the context of Islamic society. And if we describe our current situation as state-centric, then in Muslim societies of the past, we can call that family-centric societies. And the contrast is that the central institution and the central organizing building block of society was the family. Okay? And what do we mean by family? Because today, in context of state-centric societies, family just means a husband, a wife, and children, the nuclear family. But especially, you can even recognize this today in Muslim countries, and maybe when we, go overseas and visit our extended family, we can still see this structure in practice. There is an extended, what we would call an extended family of husband, wife, paternal uncles, maternal uncles, grandparents, children, cousins, in-laws. That extended family maintains a tight connection. And that extended family, again, is the central building block of society, such that all of those things that I mentioned before, economic authority, political authority, education, childcare, elder care, health care, socialization, socializing, entertainment, all of those happen in the context of the family, the extended family. And so when you look at Muslim societies, much of the education of children and the socialization of children, tarbiyah, happens in the family context. And there's this common expression that it takes a village to raise a child, right? This is literally the case. Within the family-centric society, your village is your extended family. It's a kinship system. And social structure is dependent on your ties of kinship. But in the state-centric society, where is the village that is supposed to raise children, right? There is no village. There is corporate entities and state institutions that co-opt the raising of children and the conditioning and socialization of children, and therefore the entirety of society. So this is something that we can look at the impact of, and the difference between the effects of a state-centric versus a family-centric society. But we should also note the importance of gender roles within the family-centric society. And this is something that is mentioned in Islamic law, it's mentioned in the Quran, it's mentioned in Hadith very clearly, that men and women have defined roles. And Allah says in the Quran, الرجال قوامون على النساء. Right? Very popular, famous verse. And it means that that men are the protectors and providers, قوامون على النساء, of women. And so this is defining the role of men as protectors and providers primarily. Women have the primary role within the family-centric society of providing care and education for children, as well as being responsible for the domestic domain. And we can see this very clearly as an anthropological fact. This is something that was assumed by scholars Islamically when we look at the tradition, but it's something that is also apparent within anthropological investigation of history and human cultures. And the importance of gender roles is clear because Allah has created men and women differently. The male is not the same as the female. And different genders have different strengths and have different abilities and capabilities. And this creates a harmony and a balance. And I know that many of you might find this very jarring to hear. And it might seem very antiquated and backwards. But is that because the idea in and of itself is jarring? Because when I mention roles, okay, we tend to think of roles as being very concrete and determined, and that's not what I'm trying to propose to you. Rather, roles are aspirational, and roles, gender roles within Islamic discourse are based on this larger family-centric model where that logic of having roles between genders makes sense. Okay, based on, for example, the reproductive capabilities of women, their nature, and the physical strength and male characteristics found in men. And this is something that is hard to deny unless you appeal to a kind of postmodernist or extreme subjectivist view of human nature, which we can discuss later. But I want to give you an example now of what feminists will argue in light of what I've just said about traditional gender roles and the family-centric society. What feminists will say is that traditional societies relegate women to the domestic realm in order to keep them away from political and economic power. Political and economic power is found within the public domain, and therefore, by relegating women away from the public domain within the domestic domain, traditional societies have subjugated and oppressed and disenfranchised women, right? And this is the standard argument that's given. But think of it in terms of the logic of the family-centric society, where, as I mentioned, economic authority and economic power, political authority and political power, education, and all of those other aspects of human life are within the family context and within the domestic context, which includes women as much as men. And so this notion of women being excluded from power does not apply in the context of a family-centric society. It applies in the context of a state-centric society because all of that power, economic, political, and so forth, has been extracted and ripped away from families and given to state and corporate institutions, okay? Because it's power to be able to educate children. It's power to be able to conduct business and to control the economy through corporate power. Whereas in the past, there were no corporations. Okay, all the major economic activity was on the basis of tribes and kinship groups, family, what we call family businesses, right? Those were the only kinds of businesses. And if it's a family business, then women are included as much as men are. So this critique of feminism against traditional society is patently invalid, okay, because of the structure of traditional family-centric societies and where power, economic and political, lies within that overall structure. And so when you think about family-centric societies in these terms, the entire distinction between public and private breaks down. And we should understand public and private as very modern concepts as well. Okay? Because if, as I mentioned, I keep repeating that these vital institutions surrounding education and so forth, political and economic authority, if those are within the family domain, within the domestic domain, then how is that really private? How is that really domestic? These labels that we can use are modern labels coming from, social studies and anthropology and modern categories that we're then projecting onto traditional societies, and those categories don't always fit. So this is one of the ways that we can very easily dismiss one of the main critiques that modern feminists have against traditional societies and traditional Islamic conceptions of the family and gender roles. And what I'd like to propose to you is that feminism historically, even up to this day, is and has always been a tool to disrupt and undermine family-centric societies and traditional societies and forcibly mutilate them into state-centric ones. In other words, feminism has been an instrument and a tool and a weapon of corporate state institutions against human beings, against human society. And again, this is very clearly a disaster and has had disastrous results for the human race. And on the macro scale, we can see how feminism has been used dialectically as a tool for colonialism, as a tool for industrialization and economic injustice that both Muslims and non-Muslims can recognize, and the overall corporatization of modern life. And on the personal level, we can also see attacks on the individual, downplaying the importance of marriage, encouraging divorce, encouraging termination of pregnancy, encouraging certain kinds of sexual behaviors that have been detached from the context of a family and having children and reproducing and developing large-scale families and extended families, which are a source of so much support, love, and flourishing for human beings. And this is something that we can, again, see in the nature of society today. The nuclear family continues to get smaller and smaller. The birth rates continue to get smaller and smaller. Corporate modern society has made having a large family a burden and actually a pain, where people are actually trying to avoid children and want to have nothing to do with their parents, will want nothing to do with their extended family. People move geographically across America or across the world for job opportunities, because there's this assumption that your sustenance and your livelihood in life comes from the corporate world and having a certain job. But as far as your family, well, that's, you can forego that. Who cares if you live in a completely different place and you don't have contact with your family, even your parents? Again, I'm speaking in terms of aspirations, and I understand that many people do not have the opportunity in this day and age within this room to be with their parents and to practice what I am describing as the traditional family structure. But what I want to do is inspire in you a model, okay? A model that you can recognize what we are missing out on. If you don't know what you're missing out on, then you have nothing to strive for, and you're not anchored within a tradition and an understanding of gender roles, and family that can then guide you to make decisions on how to live your life. Without anchoring, you are subject to the ebb and flow of culture and society, and you don't even recognize and realize that you are moving and that you're being moved against your own interests. And that's why being anchored in tradition and being anchored in clear, established religious principles and a model and a vision for society is so crucial, so critical, and so important. And some of the other statistics that I think are important to mention, look at the rate of, or the amount of depression that we find in society. Depression rates haven't been higher. Happiness levels, happiness index hasn't been lower. As I had mentioned before, over 50% of children born today are born to single mothers and grow up with single-parent households. And all kinds of studies have been done, scientific studies, to show that children born into single-parent households have higher dropout rates from school, have higher rates of drug use, have higher rates of criminality and ending up in prison. So this tells us something. I mean, I think the message is very clear, and we can understand it from our perspective. And if we look at human history and we look at what Islam and Islamic law encourages and inculcates, is the family, the extended family, and the importance of maintaining ties of kinship. Isn't this what we read over and over again when it comes to Islamic ethics? Okay, to respect and honor one's parents, to be good to one's extended family, to serve our extended family. And again, I'm using the word extended because that's the word that we use in our context today. But this is, again, a modern word. Really, it's just the family. You should consider all your ties of kinship as part of your family, and they have rights upon you, and you have rights upon them. There's also spiritual effects of living in this very individualistic, isolationist culture, and again, where all of your relationships are mediated through the state, right? Even when you use your phone to find friends, there are so many social apps, okay? Hopefully you're not using dating apps, but that's something that's also non-Muslims are using, and some Muslims to find their relationships through the medium of a corporate entity. So what effect does that have? What impact does that have on the quality of human life? And I think what we see is that so many people are dissatisfied and depressed and see very little meaning in life that's defined by corporations. And when we see the rise of fascism earlier in the 20th century, and even today with the alt-right, I think these things are related. If you look at some of what these neo-Nazi extremists or alt-right extremists will say, is their extreme dissatisfaction with the state of modern society. And this is very clear from an Islamic perspective why this is the case. So when the heart is not a vacuum, right? If you're not able to sustain your heart and yourself, your body, your mind in a safe and nourishing context of family, then you have to fill it with something else. And so many of these neo-Nazis, for example, and neo-fascists will feel that bond and that connection and that group satisfaction through joining a movement, right? A nationalistic, fascistic movement. Okay, so this is not a coincidence that as families break down and as society gets more and more individualistic, fascism rises and extreme nationalism becomes the order of the day. So now I want to give you some more deliberate points of critique of feminism. And I'm going to start with some just conceptual critiques, and then I'll move on to historical critiques. So as far as conceptual critiques, and this is an argument that I sometimes make but I'll have to explain it for you to understand. But what is the implication of the feminist view that women have been perpetually the victims of male subjugation? What are the implications of that? Women are the perpetual victims of male subjugation. Doesn't that mean that women are incompetent? Isn't the implication that women are somehow deficient and are not able to match wits with men, that throughout history they can perpetually be the victims of this patriarchy? And is it only modern feminists and modern women who have discovered that they are victims of this patriarchy? Does that mean all of women in the past were just ignorant? They were just being duped and they didn't realize it, and it required modern feminists to discover and exercise this brilliance to realize, patriarchy has been the source of all these problems. When you look at the historical record, you won't find feminist critiques of society. You won't find a mention of patriarchy. You won't find a mention of intersectionality or internalized patriarchy or toxic masculinity or mansplaining. These are considered major forms of oppression by modern thought, but we have zero evidence of women using these concepts and categories throughout history. And sure, you'll find examples even within the Sirah, within Hadith, that mention women complaining about an abusive husband, for example. Yes, of course, as I began the entire discussion, there are examples today and in the past of cultures that have specific practices that go against the God-given rights of women, but those are isolated. And in the past, we don't see historically women take those instances and generalize into this larger phenomenon of men exercising this patriarchy and systematically subjugating and oppressing women. So again, my question is, were women of the past just stupid? Okay, because that seems to be the implication of feminism. What if someone said that, for example, black people have been perpetually the victim of white oppression and subjugation? Wouldn't we think that that's racist? Okay, because that's historically not the case. Okay, and there are many historical examples of black civilization that has outmatched white or European civilization. You have Mansa Musa of Africa, of the Mali Empire. You have, great cities within Africa and civilizations, Timbuktu. You have enslavement of Europeans by Barbary pirates, for example. These are all examples of blacks and black civilization outmatching and overpowering European civilization or other civilizations of the time. No one historically will say that blacks have been perpetually the victims of whites. Okay, but feminism is different. Feminism says that women have perpetually been the victims of male oppression and scheming and patriarchy and internalized patriarchy and so forth. And so this is misogynistic on its face. So that is one of the main conceptual problems I'll raise for you. Now let's get into the moral problems. And if you look at the history of feminism, it actually does not begin with the so-called first wave feminists, the suffragettes, who the way that they're portrayed in the history books are as women who are just fighting for the right to vote. Okay, that's how you learn about it in history. But the history of feminism does not start with the first wave. It starts with what I can call the zero wave of feminism. The zero wave of feminists, the proto-feminists, were men, European men, who were imperialists and colonizers. And you have people like Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, Montesquieu, Condorcet, and many others. And what you'll see them do is write about how the European woman is so much better off than the savage woman, the woman within savage societies, Muslim societies, Native American societies, Aboriginal societies, African societies, and they would use this as a justification for colonization, for invading, for genocide, for stealing of land. And this was the feminism that began with colonial and imperialistic thought. And again, this is very clear in the history. If you want to read something that speaks about this, I recommend Louise Newman, White Women's Rights, which is a book in which she describes this history of the proto-feminists and how feminism was used in the 19th and even 18th century to justify all kinds of atrocities committed against native races and Muslims. And even Lord Cromer, the famous British diplomat within the 19th century also, will use the model of European women are given so many rights, European women are treated so well, they don't have to suffer through polygamy, for example, they don't have to suffer through not being educated. These kinds of caricatures were used by the early feminists to justify the occupation and colonialization of the Muslim world in Egypt, North Africa, the subcontinent, Turkey, and elsewhere. So that's the zero wave of feminism. But that line of thinking went and bleeded in and influenced the first wave, okay? And this is when the first wave of feminism is taught the way that is portrayed in public schools and even colleges as something as very benign and praiseworthy, that look at these women struggling for the right to vote. But if you actually look at the writing and the thought of some of these very notable feminist figures, it's shocking stuff. It's shocking stuff. And so I want to read you some quotes from them, and you can decide for yourself. One of the most famous, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, says, "What will we and our daughters suffer if these degraded black men are allowed to have the rights that would make them even worse than our Saxon fathers?" Frances Willard says, "The grog shop," which is kind of like a bar, "the grog shop is the Negro's center of power. Better whiskey and more of it is the great rallying cry of great dark-faced mobs. The colored race multiplies like the locusts of Egypt. The grog shop is its center of power, the safety of women, of childhood. The home is menaced in 1,000 localities at this moment so that men dare not go beyond the sight of their own roof tree." Very famous, Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, I'm sure you've heard of her in grade school and maybe college. She says, "The old anti-slavery school says women must stand back and wait until the Negroes shall be recognized. But we say, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of the woman be brought up first, and that of the Negro last." And finally, Rebecca Ann Felton, a leading women's suffrage advocate, says, "I do not want to see a Negro man walk to the polls and vote on who should handle my tax money while I myself cannot vote at all. When there's not enough religion in the pulpit to organize a crusade against sin, nor justice in the courthouse to promptly punish crime, nor manhood enough in the nation to put a sheltering arm about innocence and virtue, if it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession from the ravenous human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. If it will save one white woman, I say lynch 1,000 black men." Okay? This is a leading first-wave feminist. And there are many other statements, okay, because this is still a period of colonialism, and their view was that they had a civilizing mission. Okay, we need to civilize the savage. We need to civilize the Muslim, because look at how they treat their women. Okay, and so this was a very important part of the entire ideology, the ideology of women's rights, that if women are not practicing and living in the same way that European women are, the state-centric, increasingly corporate-centric world that Europe was becoming within the 19th century, then we need to go and we're justified in civilizing the savage. We're justified in occupying, invading, and massacring and genociding and stealing land because we are trying to civilize the savage. So this is the first wave. Okay? So hopefully that made you feel very uncomfortable. It made me feel uncomfortable to read that kind of stuff. After World War I and increasingly after World War II, we go to second wave feminism. Second wave feminism, post-Nazi Europe, drops the civilizing mission language. Okay? It's no longer about civilizing the savages. Now the language is about developing the third world. Development. We need to spread human rights. We need to spread women's rights. We need to empower the poor Muslim woman from her domestic drudgery. Again, it's motivated by the same sense. Okay? Why? Because you have colonial powers trying to organize and control Muslim society, reform and transform, reshape Muslim society to take it from its traditional mode, the family-centric mode, and make it into a corporate, state-centric mode, because that's how you control people. That's the whole point. That's the whole goal of the colonial project, and feminism, again, played a very central role, as I claimed at the beginning, in transforming and mutilating the traditional family-centric society into a corporate and state-centric society. And so now you have the language of development, the third world. No longer do you hear about civilizing the savages, but the underlying ideology and sentiments are there. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. You can read the work of Leila Abu Dughad, for example, Joseph Massad, in his very important book, Islam and Liberalism. And they talk about the transnational feminist movement up to this day, and as recently as the invasion of Afghanistan. And the rhetoric that was used to justify to the American people that Afghanistan needs to be invaded and occupied. The women in burqas who are not allowed to get an education and so on and so forth. So therefore we need to go save the Muslim woman. We need to go save the Afghan woman. That is how they were able to, within the Bush era, generate so much support for the invasion of Afghanistan as well as Iraq. And again, you can read this history very clearly and explicitly. So that's the second wave. The third wave is a complete mess. The third wave, I think from a Muslim perspective, is easy to recognize. If you have any basis in Islamic learning at all, you can recognize how corrosive and destructive it is to question the very basis of gender and sex, and to say that even biological sex is socially constructed. This is what someone like Judith Butler will say. As a transgender feminist, third-wave feminist. And this is the logical conclusion of feminist thought, that if gender roles are something that are socially constructed and imposed in order to subjugate women, okay, well, maybe even biological sex, what we call a man or what we call a male and a female, maybe that's also socially constructed. Okay, And you can see, again, the impact that that has on the family and the entire prospect of a family. You can't even determine who's male or female. Forget about gender roles. Forget about very clear responsibilities and duties for men as maintainers, protectors, and providers, and women as caretakers and educators. So again, you see within all waves of feminism this attack on the family-centric society and the family itself, and therefore of human beings. I also want to just, as I wrap up, current topics that are discussed. I think it's important that Muslims have a perspective on the questions of the day. For example, rape culture, campus rape culture. And I recommend that you read an article that came out within The Atlantic just last month titled The Uncomfortable Truth About Campus Rape Policy. And within this series, it's a series of 3 essays in The Atlantic, and The Atlantic is typically a liberal outlet. It argues that the culture that enables sexual misconduct is this kind of bacchanalian party culture where there are no clear guidelines for proper relations and interaction between the two sexes. Okay? And when you create an environment and infuse it with drugs and alcohol, then it's inevitable that you'll have a lot of messy situations, a lot of regret, a lot of remorse, and feelings of being violated, which are very real feelings. No one is denying it. But it's caused by the larger context and the larger environment that has been created, largely in part by a kind of feminist liberal mentality. And so if we talk about rape culture, and this is what the article argues, as well as other articles that were written in response, you can't address this question of rape without addressing defined roles for the genders and how to interact. If people don't know, if they don't have standards of behavior, then they will mess up. There are no defined expectations for behavior. And so it's unfair to expect young men and young women thrust in that environment, in that college environment, without parental guidance, without any family structure or support, without any defined roles and responsibilities and expectations. How can we expect young people to behave correctly? It's an unfair expectation, so something has to change. This is a crisis that even non-Muslims and even liberals have recognized. So what has contributed to this blurring of gender roles, blurring of propriety and proper behavior? If you constantly tell people that, express yourself sexually, and to be sexually healthy, you need to find avenues to express that sexuality, okay? That is such a generic advice and a generic value to impart and to impose and condition young people to adopt. Of course they're going to make mistakes. Of course they're going to fall into destructive behaviors. And from an Islamic view, this is something very obvious. It's very obvious if you tell people to indulge in their baser desires, to indulge in shahawat, that will pull the human being down, and that will cause self-destruction. Okay? We are told and taught in the Sharia and Islamic ethics and law teach us to control ourselves, to control our desires, to bring our internal state in accord with the sacred law and sacred ethics. And this is for our own flourishing, okay, on the individual level, and then again within the context of the family. Islamic law applies not only to the individual, but also to the family, also to society overall. The other hot topic often discussed is the wage gap. Why is it that women only earn 78 cents or 77 cents for every dollar that a man earns? And this is something that has been debunked already. by feminists themselves. You have feminists like Christina Summers. You have women writers who have written on this, Karen Lips, Hannah Rosen. They say that, look, if you take the aggregate of men's wages and women's wages and compare them, then yes, you'll see that gap, you'll see that discrepancy. But you also have to factor in the hours that are worked. Men are working more hours on average. So that is one of the explanations for why we would see a wage gap. There are all kinds of other factors that explain why there is a wage gap. This myth that you have women and men in the same exact roles, in the same exact time commitment, women earning less than men, is completely false. And if you don't believe me, then please refer to Christina Summers, Karen Lips, and Hannah Rosen for more information on this. And the other larger point that I think is very interesting, if we want to talk about a wage gap, the Muslim anti-feminist intellectual Zara Faris makes a brilliant point. She says that, okay, let's talk about the wage gap, but let's also talk about the education gap. Because women are graduating from higher education at a greater rate than men are. Let's talk about the violent crime gap. Because men are being killed more in violent crime at a far greater rate than women are. Let's talk about the dangerous job gap. Why is it men primarily who are in dangerous jobs? Why can't we talk about the death in the workplace gap? Okay, a big gap between how many men in the Western world die in the workplace as opposed to women. Let's talk about the life expectancy gap. Why is it that women on average live 3 to 5 years more than men? Okay, is that not also something that is due to social causes that we should address in order to bring about a more equitable society for both genders? So finally, I want to talk about Islamic perspective on this entire topic and why feminism is such a clear path to atheism. Feminism is a clear path to atheism. And I'm not trying to say that anyone who considers her or himself a feminist will become an atheist or will leave Islam. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that it becomes very difficult to be a feminist and think about Islam from a feminist paradigm because of all of the things that we see within Islamic law. Islamic law is predicated on the family-centric society. So if you have a tradition or ideology that is opposed to the family-centric society, then it will also be opposed to Islamic law. Right? And so when people, all of these questions that people often have. So look at the discrepancy between men and women's inheritance in Islamic law, or between men and women's testimony, or Muslim women not being allowed to marry non-Muslim men. So all of these points of discrepancy within Islamic law are easily resolved and can be resolved when we refer back to the difference between a traditional family-centric society versus the state-centric corporate society. Okay? And this is an extended argument that I don't have time to get into right now, but I'm just giving you a hint as to how to analyze these discrepancies that we find between the genders in Islamic law. And I want to end on a practical note. So, given that we're living in a state corporate-centric society, how can we preserve ourselves? How can we preserve our children? Many of you are young professionals. Maybe you're just getting married, or you're looking to get married. Maybe you're thinking about having kids, or you have young children. What can you do to protect yourself? What can you do to inculcate a traditional family-centric point of departure for your life? And I think it's very clear is that if you abide by the ethics and values that we're taught, maybe more so my generation than newer generations, if we practice honoring and respecting parents and serving our parents, maintaining ties of kinship, maintaining connections, and not prioritizing work insofar as you can. I know this is not always an option. I know that this is not always practical for each individual circumstance, but I'm speaking in aspirational terms. What do we see as the ideal? Because if we don't have an ideal, then we can't strive and we can't improve ourselves and try to reach those aspirations and bring about a better society. I think that if we dedicate ourselves, for example, to, try to get married, right? Try to get married to someone that is good for you, and try to have as many kids as possible. Okay? Very practical advice. Have as many kids as possible such that you can raise them right. And if you can homeschool them, all the better. If you can prevent them from spending so much time within government institutions, okay, the less that they spend within those government institutions, the better. The more that you can influence them, the more that you can condition them and bring and raise them through tarbiyah to be decent human beings and strong believers and strong Muslims. And if we do this and we very deliberately do this, then we can, within 1 or 2 or 3 generations, create big change. I think I'm very hopeful that this can happen. It just requires us to have a change in mindset. Okay, a change in mindset and a change of how we view what we aspire to. And so I wanted to leave you with practical advice. Also, before I conclude, just wanted to say that if I said anything that offended you, I really apologize for that. That was not my intention. I know that the things that I'm saying are quite controversial, and I'm very open to hearing your feedback and your criticism. And if I'm wrong, may Allah forgive me, and please forgive me. And anything that I have said that's correct, then that is from Allah, and may Allah accept. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
If the mic, can you guys hear me? Yeah, it's okay. It's not too loud. If it moves or if the folks in the back can't hear me at any point, just raise your hands or holler or something. Assalamu alaikum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So I'm very humbled to be here tonight. I want to thank Brother Daniel and I want to thank Ammar and Ali for the invitation, even though it was last minute. It is an honor to be sitting next to someone whose work I personally very much admire. My purpose here today is, bi'idhnillah, to offer a viewpoint and hopefully a tool for analyzing the issue at hand, which is feminism as it pertains to the Muslim Ummah. And given that obviously time is very limited, and given the fact that the topic of feminism is a very deep and large one, there's no way that anything I have to say can be a full account. So although my arguments and my positions today are going to be simplified for the reasons I just mentioned, they're not, I hope, misrepresentative of the critiques that I and many other Muslims share. And please understand that I'm not speaking from the perspective of a scholar, academic, or otherwise, so just keep that in the back of your mind. I have one disclaimer, which is that we're going to assume that everyone here is not going through a faith crisis and that we are practicing Muslims and that we have accepted the word of Allah. And as I share my opinions and my viewpoints, you'll see why that's an important disclaimer. So the other thing is what we're not going to be talking about. Because oftentimes when the topic of feminism comes up, the counter arguments that I get from my fellow Muslimas are about things outside of what concerns us as Muslim women. And so what we're not going to talk about is women the world over. We're not talking about women across the globe and outside of Islam. And the reason we need to clarify this point is because as Muslim women, we take the divine revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as our guiding post. It's our ideology that we subscribe to. And so that's our starting point. And that changes things because you can't assume that non-Muslim women share the same viewpoint as you. And that completely makes everything that comes after that very difficult and very confusing, and you're not going to be aligned. The other thing we're not going to talk about are the injustices that absolutely do exist within the Muslim Ummah. And Daniel alluded to this. Do women face injustice within our Ummah? Of course. Women everywhere do. And the question is that injustice systemic? I would say that if we're going to argue that the injustices that some Muslim women face, then what we're arguing is that that injustice is due to Islam. Because that's our prevailing ideology, that's how we operate, that's our starting point. But in point of fact, the injustices that some Muslim women face are a result of men neglecting Islam, not men actually following Islam. The last thing we're not going to talk about is the argument that, well, since I, as a critic of feminism, am acknowledging that injustice does occur, why am I not rallying for feminism as a solution? Even if it's one woman who's facing injustice, isn't feminism the answer to liberating her and giving her her rights? Well, this is a logical fallacy. It's a logical fallacy to state that because many Muslim women face injustices, therefore feminism is the solution, right? And this logical fallacy is known as a false alternative. You're assuming that that is the only possibility or the only solution to a problem that we're both acknowledging without considering any other possibilities. I want to make clear that to be critical of feminism is not an automatic denial of the existence of injustice, and I know Daniel said this, I just want to reiterate it. So to be critical of feminism, whether you're a man or a woman, is to reject feminism as a solution for the injustices that we acknowledge do exist. So it's to say that, yes, there is a problem, but I, as a critic of feminism, don't agree with your solution to that problem. So now that I've gotten the disclaimers kind of out of the way, I just want to give you a little bit more background about where I'm coming from. As I mentioned, I'm not a scholar. My background is in education and in English. I love language, and I love analyzing rhetoric and diving deeply into the art and the science of rhetoric, especially when we're looking at it over history and over time. Oftentimes we think of rhetoric as having the connotation of persuasion or deception, but actually rhetoric is just referring to any kinds of communication that people have with one another. That could be through speech, it could be verbal, it could be articles, it could be advertisements, the news. When the guys go to the girl's wali and try to convince him, that's all rhetoric. You name it, it's rhetoric. So, speaking of rhetoric, at last night's talk, there was a gentleman with a sign that read, "How dare you presume to know what's best for women?" Is he here? Darn. It would have just been nice to speak to him, directly. I wonder, though, do I get a free pass, then, as a woman, to speak on behalf of all women? If not him, do I get to do it? I wonder if this gentleman were here tonight, I would love to have said to him, "How dare you presume to silence a worldview that I, as a woman, agree with? Who are you, sir, to presume that all women agree with your derision of his claims?" What he did in that poster was he stated an erroneous argument, right? And this is an ad hominem fallacy, as I'm sure many of you probably noted. And an ad hominem fallacy or argument is one that goes after a person and not the problem or the argument itself. So it's an attack on the speaker or the rhetor. And I'm going to spend much of my time this evening talking about the error in reasoning, not from a conceptual standpoint, which Daniel did, but from a rhetorical standpoint, because that's my training, that's my background. So as much as I tried not to, I couldn't help myself, and I decided at the last minute to include a brief hadith, because it's on my mind constantly. and it just craves rhetorical analysis at the same time. And the hadith excerpt is, Islam began as something strange, and it will revert to being strange as it began. So the term strange is interpreted in this context to mean referring to small numbers of adherents, right? And so the term adhere itself means to bond with tremendous force to something, to be unwavering in your commitment to stick to something. How many of us today can honestly say that we haven't doubted or questioned our deen or aspects of our deen at one point in time? I'm sure that we all have at some point. And with the number of juvenile millennials, and I'm a millennial, so don't be offended, that are cowering to the clutch of feminism today, it's easy to be reminded of this hadith. And make no mistake, feminism is in competition with Islam. Feminism can and it is making Islam strange again. An ideology is defined as a system of ideals and ideas, especially one that forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy. And as Daniel just spoke at length, we can understand that with this definition, feminism is also an ideology. Ideologies are human constructs. Islam, again, as practicing Muslims, we do not believe that Islam and the divine revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a human construct. We accept it as divine revelation. So anything that is a human construct is up for criticism and is therefore fallible. And it only takes the test of time for that to occur. And I would argue that any ideology which lays claim to eradicating any sort of social justice is in some way or form trying to offer an alternative to Islamic doctrine. So I'll say that again. Any ideology which claims to eradicate social injustice is in some way or form attempting to offer an alternative to Islamic doctrine. It's saying, I'm a solution to this problem. If we accept Allah as our creator, Muhammad as our prophet, and Islam as our deen, we submit to Islam wholly, and we do not accept the idea that another ideology can enhance, refine, improve upon, or replace Islam. We accept that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed to us in the Quran is perfect and timeless. We accept that our prophet, peace be upon him, was a living example of human perfection. We accept, we submit, without doubt and without compromise. And for those who argue in favor of feminism as a solution to the injustices that some women in the ummah face, if we truly want to end injustice, then it behooves us not to try to reform Islam, but rather to return to Islam. I think even for Muslim women and men who are proponents of feminism, because I've gotten into these debates with them a lot, they'll say to me, you don't get it, Nour. We're intersectional feminists. It's different. We're not white feminists. We're not liberal feminists. And to that, I say the following. Look, at bottom, feminism, no matter what version of it is, it's making the claim that a patriarchy exists. Right? So we have to start with that. Islam does not recognize this. It doesn't recognize this system called a patriarchy. And instead, Islam teaches us about equity among the sexes, and Daniel spoke about this at length. Biological and natural differences exist, and these differences balance one another. They're in harmony with one another. And if and when injustices against Muslim women do occur at the hands of Muslim men, it is not due to a system of oppression led by the latter. It is due to regression into Jahiliyyah. It is due to distancing from Islam. So I say this as somebody who spent a decade, if not more, as an atheist. I'm an Arab American. I was born into a Muslim family. My parents were, culturally Muslim, prayed on and off, Ramadan on and off. But when I went off to undergrad, I immersed myself in Western academics, Western philosophy, sociology, history, anthropology, gender and women's studies, religious studies, literature, the humanities, the gamut. And it took little to no time to convert me from a cultural Muslim to a staunch atheist. And during that decade, I was very vocal about the non-existence of a higher power. Don't ask me how my family reacted. It wasn't pretty. But atheism gave me an intellectual satisfaction because it made sense to me until it stopped making sense. And it wasn't until I began subjecting atheism to the same scrutiny that I had subjected Islam to that I finally started to see a little bit more clearly. So going back to analyzing feminism from a rhetorical stance, there's something called the rhetorical situation. And scholars then and now who study language and the art of communication talk about this at length. The rhetorical situation is basically the context of any rhetorical act. So if you are watching a film, if you're having a conversation, if you're listening to a talk, there are certain things that no matter what kind of form of rhetoric it is, you can count on those things being available. And those are the rhetor, the communicator, the speaker, the issue at hand, the medium. Is it a film? Is it a speech? Is it an advertisement? And then there's you guys, the audience. And from my work with feminists, what I have found constantly when I'm looking at the rhetorical situation of a conversation with them is that they're attempting to carve out a space within identity politics because that's the palatable political move today. So the left has given Muslim feminists license and oftentimes funding to pursue that endeavor, to pursue this idea of intersectional feminism and Islamic feminism. They're very heavily supported by the left. And what Muslim feminists or Muslims in the Ummah who may not identify as feminists but who subscribe to those ideologies stand to gain is public approval from what is clearly a very aggressive and tone-policing left. And at the same time, they're trying to maintain ties within the Muslim community. So what I truly believe is happening among many of my fellow Muslim women, insofar as my limited experience as one individual goes, is they're trying on the one hand to not break away from their Muslim community. That would be catastrophic for a lot of them. But at the same time, as Western-bred Muslims, they're attempting to reconcile their identities as women in the West. And so there's a lot at stake for them. That's why they hate him and what he has to say. There's a lot at stake. And we all have something at stake, right? If you look at the rhetorical situation, you have to ask yourself, what is at stake for this rhetor, for this communicator? What do they stand to lose or gain? And so when Daniel touched on the way in which rhetoric has shifted over the three waves of feminism, first wave feminism being, the language of civilizing the savage, second wave feminism being about development, today, I think, we could make the argument that we're in an era of surrogacy, where we no longer accept that some white imperialist is going to speak on our behalf. Instead, the folks who are going to perpetuate or instill Western values in our community are our own people. It's not going to come from someone who you would look at and say, why would you talk for me? No, she looks like me. She's got on hijab. She has a degree. She prays 5 times a day. She fasts. But she's also a feminist. So what does that mean? So we're battling each other now, right? So can men speak about women's issues? Mansplaining. Just Google that word. There's a really good article online. This feminist talks about why that word needs to go. And she's a white feminist, and it's brilliant. Just Google it. It's awesome. Well, when people ask that question, can men really speak to women's issues? I wonder, when the Quran was revealed to our Prophet, peace be upon him, why was he permitted and given authority by God to speak on behalf of all of creation, including women? Is he not a man? Was he not a man, rather? Did not his words, which came from Allah, include all of creation? We accept that as practicing Muslims, so why at this point do the same people who identify as Muslims take issue with any man, not just Daniel, but any man, speaking even remotely about something to do with women's issues? And if that doesn't convince you enough, then let's talk about identity politics, which is, something that came to the fore in the 1960s. Everything happened in the 1960s, apparently. And it was a response to the failure of the Western political left to bring about fundamental social and economic change. And since then, people are increasingly evaluated as constituents of subset classifications, whether it's race, ethnicity, religion, gender, disability, sexuality, and so forth. Since then, identity politics has infiltrated our discourse, be it social or political, and it teaches us to always begin our statements with qualifiers, so as to sort of redress or disqualify anyone who falls outside of that subset. And I'll give an example in just a moment. So why is identity politics problematic? Well, because most of these categories are already determined for us, except for maybe religion. You don't choose what gender you're born into. You don't necessarily get to choose your family. You don't get to choose your nationality. You don't get to choose your race. These things are determined for you at birth. And so we have no control over those things. But identity politics tells us that we're doomed or damned depending on what subsets we're born into. So if you're a woman, get ready to fight the patriarchy. And if you're a man, get ready to be emasculated. That's just the way that it is. And so in that sense, it's very disempowering. It causes us to become complacent because our worth is being measured by our birth subsets. And in some ways, I think it infantilizes us as adults. It makes us feel like we're constantly in need of playing defense rather than taking hold of our own lives and our own choices in the ways that Islam tells us to. And Islam rejects identity politics. We know that our worth is contingent upon our iman and our taqwa. It has nothing to do with our race or our gender or our ethnicity. It has everything to do with something that we have control over and that we can strive to improve. So the rhetoric of identity politics is rooted in three rhetorical fallacies, and they work in tandem. The first is the a priori authority, the second is ad hominem arguments, and the third is the false alternatives. And the reason I'm talking about identity politics is because feminism falls within or uses the language of identity politics. So folks who subscribe to the rhetoric of identity politics will oftentimes rely on a priori or a priori authority. So they'll use certain phrases, as I mentioned, from the onset in order to establish presumed authority and credibility that comes after. So by starting a statement with, I as a woman, that means nothing you say is gonna matter at this point, right? Or I as a gay man, nothing you say as a straight man is gonna matter, right? And this kind of subjective language has now become valid in debates and in political discourse. So being a member of a subset identity group lends a speaker supposed, and that's the key word, supposed authority or authentic insight, and it leads him or her to demand redress as a victim of systemic oppression, and in this case we're talking about feminism and the patriarchy. But on the flip side, the other subsets are viewed as less authentic and they're written off due to historically inherited privilege. So identity politics, of which feminism is a fan, it hinges on the rhetoric of victimhood, that you are born as a victim, and pretty much nothing you do unless you fight is going to change your conditions. And the thing that you're fighting are these phantasmagorical notions like patriarchy. Good luck finding it. The emotional responses that I often hear from Muslim feminists, like, I'm offended, or how dare you, like that poster, how dare you? It now carries weight in debates when reasonable conclusions are drawn that threaten the beliefs of the person who is claiming victimhood. So all bets are off at that point. Somebody's offended, done. I mean, don't you get offended when feminists talk? I do. We carry on. But I think what Daniel has discussed is a matter of reason and evidence, and it's why I'm a fan of much of what he has to write and what he has to say. And if you look closely, it's actually feminists in their responses to much of what he has to say, who are employing gender essentialism to cast over generalizations. So if we're going to reject him or any other man or woman who is critical of feminism, if we reject an idea on the basis of the speaker or his delivery, then we fall prey to what is known as the a priori fallacy. And when we're analyzing and debating the topic, we have to understand the speaker is irrelevant. Focus on what he is saying. The message is what we're after, and we have to learn to separate the person from the problem. And this is something that continuously breaks down dialogue between critics of feminism and feminists. And if you just take a look around the room, I mean, where are the women? So you may not like the message, and you may not like how that message is being delivered. I know that some of you are more offended by Daniel's approach or his style, more so than what he has to say, but can you cogently refute the message itself? Can you, with a straight face and with a clear heart, say that what he is arguing goes against Islam? So keep in mind that when you're having conversations with or about feminism or feminists, that identity politics is going to sort of dictate and police the conversation. You need to reframe that dialogue before you even have it. And you need to make sure that from the beginning, you are leaving emotions to the side and you're having a very objective, as much as possible, conversation about the topic at hand. Okay, so then is feminism antithetical to Islam? I know there are tons of articles out there by Muslim women who say, no, it is not, and then they'll cite, different parts of the Quran or the Hadith and talk about Khadija and women riding horses and all of that good stuff. Okay, yeah. We already established that feminism is an ideology that seeks to modify in its least aggressive form, or if not completely overthrow Islam in its most aggressive form. And we've already established that it's grounded in identity politics, which Islam overthrew when it was revealed to the Prophet 1400 years ago. And we've already established that feminism thrives on the notion of a patriarchy. It doesn't matter what category of feminism you subscribe to. So I think for these reasons, if none other, any version of feminism is clearly going to be antithetical to Islam. It is a competing ideology. It is rooted in secular liberalism, which we understand is the separation of religion and state, and Islam does not agree with that. Islam is a lifestyle. It permeates every aspect of a human's lived experience. And so if feminism itself isn't sort of birthed out of secular theory, it is going to brush up against many of our Islamic tenets. So I would say that we have to do sort of a historical analysis, at least starting with the fall of the caliphate. We at least have to start there to understand the ways in which, if not further back, to understand the ways in which feminism or feminist theory has permeated the Muslim world, and the ways in which it's manifesting itself today to be this Muslim or Islamic feminism. So the last thing I'll say is I just want to address the noise and the controversy that continues to surround this topic. I decided it was important to speak up on this issue because to not do so would have meant to allow feminists within the Ummah to speak on my behalf. And it would have meant accepting the prevailing narrative among Muslim millennials that indeed there is a system within Islam that is out to get each and every female. If I were to remain silent, it would be to concur with feminists that Islam, the Quran, and the divine revelation of our Creator is actually faulty. So I also decided to speak out because I know that there are many silenced Muslim women who are too intimidated and fearful to speak their minds. And they, like men, are shouted down, they're silenced by feminists within our ummah, all too often in aggressive, violent, and un-Islamic ways. I've been there, I am there, and honestly, there's no shortage of ridicule and threats that comes through my inbox daily, but we persevere, alhamdulillah. It takes a lot of courage to change your worldview, and I know this because I reverted to Islam. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of sacrifice, you will lose people in your life, and it takes time. And if you genuinely are committed to seeking reason and truth, then analyze the evidence objectively and separate the person from the problem, debate the ideas and not the people. Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you so much for your time.
Assalamu alaikum. I'd just like to extend some more gratitude for our speakers, Daniel, who came a very long way, and Nour, who came, a shorter distance, but she came straight from the bus station here after a 5-hour journey, something like that, and rightfully calling us out on inviting you last minute when we should have thought of you a lot earlier. Just for housekeeping, we have about an hour and 15 minutes for Q&A, and just by show of hands, how many of you are interested in asking a question or commenting, just so we can figure out if we're going to do individual callouts or just lineups in the aisle? Just raise it. Okay. I think that it would be better because more people will probably have questions based on future questions. If we do a lineup in both aisles with a microphone at the bottom of each, speak clearly into the microphone, and if you wish a certain speaker to address the question first, just mention that, and I guess we'll just have at it.
Come one, come all. You can start?
Yeah, please start.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know if I missed this because I tried to understand the answer of my question from your talk, but probably I just missed it or you didn't mention. Can you explain what is feminism, what are its assumptions, and what are the conclusions that they make? Because to me, feminism means nothing because it means a million things, All people say I'm a feminist, but they have different perspectives, they're advocating for different things. What is feminism, and what is so problematic about it that you're saying it's kind of not in agreement with Islam?
Was that for a specific person? Or either of us? Or both?
You go first.
I guess
You go first.
You, however you want.
Okay, so
I think you can talk about the politicals.
yeah, so feminism is, I tried to give a historical, intellectual history of feminist thought, beginning from what I call the zero wave, to the first wave, to the second wave, to the third wave. A lot of feminist discussion or debating with feminists that I've had throughout the years falls into this kind of no true Scotsman fallacy, which if you studied logic, you know what that is, but to summarize, you can always say that, oh, well, that's not a true feminist view, or you can always say that, well, there's a diversity of opinion on feminism, and therefore no critique that you can make is valid because there's always going to be a particular feminist who disagrees or doesn't hold that view. So it's kind of a slippery target. The goalposts are constantly moving within the discussion. And that's why I tried to focus on major figures historically within the feminist movement, people who no one would deny are leading figures of feminism. And when you see the kinds of things that they say, what I try to show is that they're problematic, not even from a Muslim perspective, just from a human perspective. When we went over the kind of racist views of the first wave feminists, their anti-black views. When we look at the second wave of feminism, I didn't get into, for example, Simone de Beauvoir, and the kinds of things that she said that would strike any reasonable person as just outrageous. And some have claimed that she was even a Nazi sympathizer and supporter. And if you look at the details of her life, she wrote The Second Sex, which was, considered one within the canon of feminist thought and one of the most important works of second wave feminism. If you read her book and the kinds of things that she says, I think any reasonable person would find it quite shocking, not to say even a Muslim, a Muslim even more so. And third wave feminism has recognized all of this ugly history, and that's why there's this critique within third wave feminists of, well, we reject the white feminist because they want to distance themselves from this very disgusting history of feminist thought. But that's the roots of your entire paradigm, of your entire philosophy, right? If your philosophy is based on the thought of colonizers, racists, imperialists, promoters of genocide, you have some serious soul searching to do. So there are many kinds of critiques, moral critiques, conceptual critiques. What I mentioned in my talk and some of what Nour mentioned is just scratching the surface. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Does that answer your question, or?
I want a more concrete answer. I want really more kind of bullet points. What are the assumptions and what are the conclusions that they make in their argument that you find so problematic?
Okay, so for me, one of the primary sort of dilemmas with feminist theory is the idea that there is a systematic oppression of women at the hands of men. And I have yet to find, a body of literature that aligns with Islam that has proven this point. Right? There's a lot of secular literature out there that, talks about, as Daniel, discussed, the wage gap, or the idea that all the power is in the public sphere and not in the private sphere. That's fine, but that's not the world of Islam. And this is why I was saying we need to go back and understand what our ancestors experienced before the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Because the family domain held a lot of power, and that's where women were. So this notion that there is a system that works in every way, politically, socially, economically, to oppress women and to strip them of their rights, it doesn't hold true when we're looking at things from an Islamic perspective. Does that give you one concrete answer? Okay.
I'm sorry, you will be next, but just if anyone doesn't want to stand in the aisles, then I'll write a number on the board. You can text that number, and I'll read them alternating with the people standing in the aisle.
Yeah, if you don't want to actually ask your question out loud, you prefer to text it in, and Amar will read it, so you don't have to feel like you have to come to the front.
Okay. Here's me.
No.
Oh, it's off. Okay, so I have quite a few things to say. So just starting with the fact that, with what you just said, that a lot of feminists say oh, that's not a real feminist, that's not what actually feminists believe. You find that in literally every organization or group or whatever. Obviously there's Muslims out there that people who say they're Muslims that do terrible, terrible things, and then here we are in the West or in Muslim countries saying, well, those are not real Muslims, they're saying they're Muslims, but they're really committing terrorist acts and things like that, you know what I mean? So you're making that point that it's invalid because we do the same thing as Muslims, do you know what I mean? But you can respond to that because I have other things to say.
Okay, I can respond to it. Yeah, I can respond to it. I think that we can say who is a representative of any tradition. When it comes to Islam, there are very clear, objective, agreed upon standards within Islamic theology as to who is or who is not a Muslim. And I don't think that this is problematic. I know that there are postmodernists, intersectionalists today who will say, oh, whoever claims to be a Muslim, no matter what they believe, we should take their claim at face value as long as they identify. This is identity politics, right? No, there's actually objective criteria for who is or is not a Muslim, and the body of scholarship, traditional scholarship for 1400 years has attested to that. And what I'll say in addition is that we don't accept that kind of subjectivism when it comes to any other discipline. For example, we're at Harvard Medical School. If someone comes up off the street and says, I'm a doctor, I'm a neurologist, and I'm going to teach you about neurology, no one would accept that, okay, just on the basis of the claim to identify as a neurologist, right? There are certain criteria. Have you studied the right things? Have you accepted the right positions? That would determine who fits within the group, within that category of trained doctor versus those who are not. Same thing in the sciences, okay? Who can say who a physicist is? Is there such a thing as a physicist? But is it like just wide open, a subjective label that anyone can claim for himself? No, there are objective criteria. You have to go through, learning. You have to get a degree. If you want to teach, you have to get a PhD. So we accept that. And even morally, this is a critique that's often made. Who can say what is or is not Islamic, right? This is something that I'm often criticized as, oh, you're speaking on behalf of Islam. Who gave you the right? How dare you? But, when we look at other categories, like, for example, what countries in the world are true democracies, right? North Korea claims to be a true democracy. Does anyone accept that claim? Do political scientists accept that claim? Do liberal secularists accept that claim? No, they reject it. They say that there's objective criteria for what counts as a true democracy. We can know what a true democracy is. So when it comes to these modern, liberal, secular categories, they're objective and they have criteria, and all educated, reasonable, rational people can identify them. But when it comes to religion, in particular Islam, then no, that's up for grabs. Whoever claims to be Muslim, then we should just accept their claim at face value. So you can see that there's a contradiction in that line of thinking.
For sure, but in Islam, it's not required to go to university and study Islamic things. You know what I mean? Someone can be Muslim and know one surah and pray with that one surah.
Can you be Muslim and not believe in God?
No, obviously you have to believe in God, but what I'm saying is, as if the point you're making, you're moving away from the statement I had made earlier, because you're implying that being a feminist is you have to have all these you don't. I'm sorry, there's just so many things that I'm
Sure, take your time.
Obviously I'm very firm in my beliefs. You guys did have more time to present and think about what you're gonna say. But from the point that I just made, I feel like you moved away from it and made points that were not relevant, in the sense that someone can say I am Muslim and commit terrible acts, and us Muslims, and I'm so sorry. You don't need to know that much about Islam to be a Muslim, and us as Muslims, we can't tell someone else that you're not Muslim. Does that make sense? In Islam, we can't say you're not a Muslim, and I don't know. I'm sorry. sorry, I'm just getting flustered at this point. Moving away on another point to make.
If you don't mind, just because you asked one question, if you're asking a new question, I'd like to just take one from the text audience.
For sure.
Okay. I've got it. This question is for Noor. How do you understand and interpret the verse "Ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa"?
I mean, are you asking me to translate it? Are you what? Can they elaborate on the question?
The question was texted. How do you understand and interpret the verse? You can translate it for the audience, but every translation is also an interpretation.
Right. Okay, so whoever asked that question, can you just follow up with a text message and just clarify, like, what about that do you actually want me to respond to? Because that's a big question. So just follow up.
I'm just asking how do you personally understand the verse? Like what
So are you asking about the entirety of the verse or just the first part of it? Al-Rijal. Yeah, so I mentioned it at the beginning. Men are qawwamun ala nisa.
Qawwamun meaning, my understanding of qawwamun is that they're equitable, or that they have their own, trying to figure out how to explain it in English, that they're different from women in specific ways. That's my understanding of that term. So do you want me to explain why I think that, or why I agree with that? So my philosophy is that, and this comes from my belief in Islam, is that we're striving for equality when that's not what we should be striving for. We should be striving for equity. And the way that Daniel sort of described this in his talk is the difference between the egocentric society, which is the society that we live in, and the familial sort of centered society, where our choices and the way that we live our lives is not centered around us as individuals, but around a community, a society. That the doctrines of our deen are there because that is what's best to build an ummah. Okay, so I think in terms of that verse, we have to understand and we have to respect and we have to humble ourselves to the attributes of a man, the attributes of a woman, understand, as Daniel said, their strengths and their powers. As an educator, I dare any one of you to come into a classroom of 36 children and try to command them and then try to teach them. It's a hard job. And yet we treat education and the rearing of children as though it is mundane and trivial. And we've stripped that strength away from women, and what makes us so nurturing and our inclination towards emotion is precisely what's needed in building a family. It's precisely what's needed in building ultimately a society, because a society is just groups of families. Does that answer your question?
Can I also, is it okay if I add on a couple of thoughts? I mean, you can read the tafsir, exegesis of that verse, and what qawama entails, qawamun, what that entails. It's generally translated as protector and provider. When I think about the role of men and my role as a father and a husband, so I have, I married my wife when I was pretty young. We have 3 young boys, ages 5, 3, and 2. And I view my role as a protector and a provider. So the example of this is that if we're all sleeping in the middle of the night and we hear glass break downstairs, okay, who's going to go down and check if there is a murderer who just entered my house? It's not going to be my wife. It's not going to be my kids, right? Is that fair? Is that equitable? The man is expected to make the ultimate sacrifice. It's women and children first. And the expectation that all men accept not only accept, but like proudly accept and feel the urge and the need and the desire to protect and provide as true men, right? Because you can be a male, but there's a difference between just being a male, having like the anatomy of a male, and being a man, right? And there's definitely this sense of chivalry in Islamic ethics that men are the protectors and the providers, being a generous provider. And there are so many narrations, prophetic narrations of this, and the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, speaking about what an amazing protector and provider he was. You know, the epitome of manhood, right? And this is what we should aspire to. Unfortunately, if you take that for what it is, it's certainly not equitable. Okay, it would be a shame. It would be, a travesty if women put their lives on the line to protect men, right? I think anyone of sound fitra, like sound internal state, would just cringe at the thought that a man has to be protected by, or a woman has to put her life on the line in the face of danger to protect a man, okay? But I don't know how feminists feel about that, if they want to comment. But yeah, I think it's very clear Islamically, and just the role of a man as protector and provider, I think any reasonable person can accept and see that, and Islamic law and ethics positions man in that role. And it's just a question of, do we accept it?
Just to quickly follow up on that, having been married, and also lately I've just been reading up a lot about the fall of the caliphate, and we can argue theoretically that when it comes to decision making or final executive decision making, that we can come together as a body of people and collectively decide what's going to happen. But in practice, that causes a lot of problems, and this is why you ultimately need one person to make the final call, right? Yes, you have your advisors. Yes, you have a group of people that you converse with, and mentors who may advise you, but ultimately someone has to make the final call and make the decision. And so that verse reminds me of that idea. If we take it just in terms of a marriage or, a family unit, I would hope that any husband is obviously keeping his wife in tune with what's going on, and she's doing the same thing, and they're having conversations, they're working, as a team, but ultimately one person has to make the final decision. If we're thinking about this in terms of an Islamic worldview, and by that I mean a society that, operates under the Sharia, there is a Khalifa that is, sort of overseeing society, then those tough decisions are tough decisions. Why put a woman on the line, as Daniel just, finished discussing? Why risk the lives of women or, children when it comes to these political spheres and political issues that are taking place? Because these are the big decisions that ultimately happen. Someone's got to go out there and risk their neck. I don't know how guys feel about that, but that's kind of the way that I also look at that verse.
I'm sorry, just because there's more people behind you that were there behind you when you asked your previous question. If you could, just for sake of fairness, maybe we'll rotate so everyone.
All right. First of all, I'll see what I just have a couple of comments, and one is the first thing that Daniel said is that. Saying that only women can speak on feminism is like saying that only communists can speak on communism, and I think that's inherently flawed, because being a communist, as a political ideology, you're not born into being communist. You can't just, you're not stuck in being communist, that's a political ideology that you believe in, whereas being a woman is something that you're born into, being a man is something that you're born into, and it's not an experience that a man could truly understand. Another thing is...
Can I respond to that? Or?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you said that you're not stuck being a communist, but you're also not stuck being a feminist, right?
But I am stuck being a woman.
Yeah, so there are men who are feminists too.
Mm-hmm.
So they can speak on the behalf of feminism, I assume.
No, I don't think so.
So men can't? You can't have like a male gender studies professor?
You can have those beliefs, but you really can't speak on it with a word. You are having experienced it.
So, okay, so they can't really speak. The male gender studies professor or...
Well, men are allies, they're not feminists.
There we go.
So men can't be feminists?
They're allies.
Okay, allies. So then what will you say about the argument that I presented that feminists...
And gender studies professors report on feminists and teachers of feminists. Professors don't talk about their own opinions, they talk about readings and studies and things like that.
So can I ask a follow-up question to that? As a woman, right, to use that qualifier,
Yeah,
if I disagree with your view of what it means to be a woman, what the female experience is, what does that then mean in terms of an argument?
Well, just to say that you were talking about identity politics and how it sort of, when you start something by saying I am a woman and this and that, but that is how you started your speech by saying that, I am a Muslim woman and I work with them and I can rewrite it to Islam. And that's why you should take my argument seriously.
No, I shared that really to talk about where I'm coming from as a non-scholar. Because usually when you come to talks like this, you're talking about, people who've done research and that research has been backed by Western authority. So as an intelligent audience, you have a right to know, well, who is this person who's sitting here who's about to share something about herself? So I shared something about myself. But again, it's an ad hominem fallacy to say that because of someone's subset of an identity, male, sexuality, religion, political, influence, that they can't discuss a particular topic. If I were to take any one of Daniel's pieces, make it anonymous, or put my name on it, feminists would still have an issue with it, but I wouldn't get attacked because I would be considered a man. I'd get attacked because I'm complacent, because I'm brainwashed.
You've internalized patriarchy.
And I've internalized patriarchy.
There's enough room for men to defend themselves in this world. They do not need anyone.
I'm not defending men. I'm defending Islam.
That's what you've been doing.
I'm defending Islam.
All right.
And really, that's what it comes down to. I'm defending
Before
my
this goes off topic, and to keep the order of the House, if this comment is done being addressed with by the speakers, because I know you had a second comment, correct?
I mean, there's also, let me just make one more point and then we can get to the second part of your comment. I mean, look at the logic here. Only if you've had a certain set of experiences or you're born a certain way, you can comment. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, if you're an American, then how dare you speak about women in the UK or in France, because you don't have their experiences. How dare you, you're in Boston, how dare you speak on behalf of women in New York or Chicago or LA? Completely different experiences, completely different culture. How dare, you can extend that logic to all kinds of depths. And what does that mean? That's a complete breakdown of all rationality and reasoned discourse, right? So take this idea to its logical conclusion, right? Don't just take the soundbite or the cliche that identity politics has been ramming into, in our throats over the past 5 years since social justice has taken this terrible turn. Take it to its logical conclusion. Like, how can you speak for women? Because, there's plenty of women across the world, all kinds of different cultures. You can only limit yourself to yourself, okay? Because even the woman next door is a different experience, different life, different culture, perhaps. So see how isolationist and individualistic that kind of logic leads to.
Being able to speak on feminism by saying that, people who aren't communists and speak on communism, should probably be omitted from your future lectures because it's just really going to all sorts of.
All right, thanks for the suggestion.
Also, you just said, and when you were speaking to the question up there, you were like, having been married, and you just used the same exact sentence structure in that moment. You know what I mean?
No, I don't know what you mean.
Because you were earlier.
Well, can you use the mic?
Can't speak.
We can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Earlier you were saying you can't say well, I mean, you can't say you were saying that in arguments saying as a woman and as a whatever has been included in our debates and is valid now. But you had just said having been married.
What was the context of that? So yeah, so let's take
no,
an
but
example.
I understood the context. You just said the same thing.
But it's not the same thing.
But
Because in his question, he's asking me to interpret something. And I'm saying from my limited perspective, as someone who's been married, I'm not using that as a way to say anyone who hasn't been married therefore can't speak to this issue. I'm saying I'm coming in from a limited perspective. I'm acknowledging a limited perspective. There's a difference there. The example or the concept that I was sharing when I was giving the talk is when we use those qualifiers in terms of identity politics, the motivation there is to exclude certain people from being able to talk about that topic. That wasn't the way that I used my
motivation
statement.
also to give a context of as a black woman, if there's a context that comes along with that and experiences that I have that you as an Arab woman won't necessarily understand, and you have experiences that I won't understand that are so it's a valid thing to make it.
It's totally valid, but what I'm saying is when we're looking at this as a framework, right? Of course we all have subjective experiences, and of course we all share experiences depending on race, ethnicity, gender, etc. It's not that you can't use those terms, but we have to understand that within our political and social discourse, and in terms of our ummah itself, we've hijacked that language that was once valid to express an individual's subjective point of view. We now use it as a way to cast authority over an entire debate. And that's a fallacy. That's incoherent. It doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. It's an emotional reaction. It's a cop-out. It's a way of saying, therefore, anything I say after this, I'm the authority on this. But you haven't proven that you're the authority on it. Just because you identify of a certain subset identity, that now means that you're the authoritarian for that. So I can't speak on behalf of all Arab women, can't speak on behalf of all Muslim women, can't speak on behalf of all women. I can't. So if I'm going to make a broad statement or an argument that affects a large group of people, I have to be very careful in how I use that language, because I'm using subjective, individualistic terminology to make conclusions about an entire group of people. It doesn't work that way.
That's what you're doing about feminists.
All right, just to keep the order of the House moving along, we'll take one question from the text messages which are coming in, and then Zainab. What is the Islamic perspective on transsexuals and hermaphrodites and, oh no, I'm sorry. Nope, that's the correct. What is the Islamic perspective on transsexuals and hermaphrodites? And in what ways is feminism's approach to these groups problematic?
So this is it's a big topic. Can't really do it justice in a Q&A. I will just refer you to a very good book, or not book, but great article written by Mubin Vaid. And it was recently published in Muslim Matters, and he looks at the question of transgender and transsexuality in the context of Islamic thought, classically. And what he demonstrates is that there is a very nuanced, sophisticated discussion of gender and what's called mukhannathun within the classical Islamic tradition. And this is a discussion that goes back even to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And there are narrations of effeminate men who were Sahaba, and the different legal rulings that apply to them in that category. So there's a very sophisticated treatment of this issue. We need to reacquaint ourselves and not think that, oh, this is just a modern issue that Islam is ignorant of, that we have to create this kind of reformist theology to address. No, we have a very sophisticated and rich tradition that addresses these specific cases of what we would term today as gender non-conformant, quote unquote. So I highly recommend you read Brother Mubin Vaid's essay on this. It's very well written and cited, and he talks about the issue in depth. So that's on muslimmatters.org. Definitely check it out.
Hold on 1 second, I have an announcement. And if you're going to ask a question, we have established an order to stand in line. And there's a lot of chatter that I was told was coming from the audience. So if we could...
Brother Daniel, just to point out something, you were answering a question about transgender individuals, but I think the question was about transsexual and hermaphrodite, meaning biological.
Yes, that article addresses the distinction there. Because you have intersex, you have effeminacy, those are all issues that are addressed within that paper.
Yeah, and again, if you're going to be speaking, please do so out of the room. If you're going to leave the room, please do so respectfully. The next question is, unless Nour,
Nour, do you have anything to add?
Nope, I'm not a scholar of Islam. I can't answer that question. Sorry.
Yeah, neither am I, but I refer you to that article.
I see myself in the women standing in front of me, and I just wanted to affirm you and from your experiences. And I think, I think this. It can feel, when you learn about patriarchy and all of these frameworks, like you've been given a language for the world around you that you didn't have before, and there's a lot at stake in that. And so I just wanted to encourage you to stay open and stay questioning and critical, look for answers and ask Allah for guidance in that process, because it's a deep one, and it demands a lot. I also appreciate the perspectives brought forth, both about kind of the powerful alternative of family-based traditional social structures, and I think reevaluating debate in good faith, and sort of like our millennial discourse steeped in identity politics. And I think what I'm struggling with most about this discussion is, maybe I'm not understanding, but what I'm understanding as the rejection of any systemic basis for the abuses that face women today, of which Islam can be corrective. So if that system isn't patriarchy as a constant throughout human history, aren't the very historical events that you described, the emergence of modernity, liberalism, bases for a systemic subjugation of women? Or, on the other hand, the reactionary ways that Muslim societies have responded to colonialism in ways that are punitive for women and stray from our tradition, our religious tradition. And so is the rejection of patriarchy, so that's the first question, I guess. Is there no systemic basis, even if it's temporally and contextually bound? And then the second is, if the rejection of this sort of systemic basis is in step with rejecting identity politics, then is institutional racism a fallacy too? Do systems of oppression exist in your worldview, even, again, if they are temporally and contextually bound?
Great question, big question. A few things. One of the first things that I had mentioned is that to be critical of, the ideas that we've been talking about today is not to say that these injustices don't exist. Of course racism exists. I don't think anyone here is saying that that doesn't exist, or that people of color and, African Americans have been subjected to some of the worst crimes that humanity could ever commit. But when we're using the word systemic or systematic, we're talking about power that exists on every single level, every layer of society. It means the policies are, congruent with that system of oppression, whatever it may be, patriarchy in this example. And you ask the question, does that mean it has never existed contextually or, over time? Contextually, let's take, now. There are women suffering at the hands of men, be it, in one household, within a small extended family, or within an entire community. As you continue to go broader, you have to ask yourself the question, does that injustice perpetuate itself up until, at the governmental level at the institutional level, in every facet of that society. And at some point, it breaks down. There are people who step in, oftentimes men, who say, this is wrong. What are you doing? This is ridiculous. And so that wouldn't occur if truly there is a system where all men are in agreement that women are weak, need to be, controlled, or whatever language you want to use. So I think the key word there is systemic or systematic. You will find, obviously, examples of one gender exerting power over another. And I think more and more today, if you look at Western society and the way that our families are sort of set up, the inverse is starting to happen. There are a lot of examples of women who exert aggression towards men or emasculate them in different ways. We could argue, from a feminist perspective, that that's a backlash. Sure, if you want to make that argument, that's fine. But I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at history, up until maybe the postmodern world, power was physical strength, right? Now it's your brain, your ability, your intellect. And so it's the tables are sort of turning in that sense. That's all I have to offer to that question.
Sure, I think that it would be wrong to say just because myself and Nour have rejected the idea of this universal patriarchal system of oppression, that what is entailed by that is we reject all the very possibility of a system of oppression.
Right.
And that's the point that I was trying to make, is that I can accept, or I think the feminist claim of universal patriarchy is unique. You don't find any other class of human beings that are thought to have been subjugated universally throughout time. So yes, there is a deep systematic oppression that is happening in this country to this day and has a long history of oppression against black people. Undoubtedly. It continues today, and that doesn't mean that black people have been oppressed universally by white people, and that's why I mentioned the Mali Empire, Timbuktu, the Barbary pirates who enslaved Europeans. That was my point with that example. I don't have to, but the feminist claim of patriarchy is very unique, okay? That inherently women are victims of male aggression and patriarchal structures. And I think what's interesting is analyzing that claim just on a theoretical, analytical basis. I think the implications of it are quite stark. It impugns male character and men as these barbarians who would institute this system to keep women down. So what does that say about male nature? And what does it say about female nature? That for centuries and millennia, they are constantly getting the wool pulled over their eyes, and they're constantly being violated and subjugated. And they don't even realize it because you don't see any historical record that's analogous to modern feminist thought, third wave feminist thought. No one's talking about mansplaining in the 2nd century or in the 5th century. So I think these raise important questions that any reasonable person can ask and reflect on. And I agree with Nour that we can point to cultural practices, we both referred to it, within Muslim societies. There are practices that are systemic, where women are getting the short end of the stick, and I don't deny that. I think certain practices within the Arab world, the subcontinent, within Persia, Turkey, etc., definitely.
Or even here in the West.
Or in the West, yeah. Good point. Here in the West. But there are other instances of systematic oppression of men as well. And I can give you a lot of different examples, like when it comes to reproduction, do men have the right to have children? Okay, it's not really a question that's asked, because if you accept the idea that it's woman's body, woman's choice, she always has the right to decide to terminate a pregnancy, the unqualified right to terminate a pregnancy, then the implication of that is that men don't have a right to children. It's always a qualified right. They just have to find someone who for 9 months is willing to be pregnant and bear a child. But if at any point within the pregnancy the woman decides, my body, my right, and terminates the pregnancy, then that means the man doesn't have a right to children. So is that just? Like, is that equity that supposedly women's rights movement is striving for? And there are so many examples that you can easily analyze within our context where men are systematically having their rights denied. And I don't like to take on the label of a men's rights activist because it's so politicized. But you don't have to take that label to just use your brain and think about it for a minute. There's this great documentary called The Red Pill. It was made by a feminist filmmaker. She considered herself a feminist throughout her life, and she wanted to do a documentary on the men's rights movement, basically showing how irrational and immoral and vile they are. And to her surprise, and she documents her experience, by the end of it she realized, wow, they actually have a lot of good points. And I have to question my commitment to feminism in light of what they're saying. I think there's a lot to say or there's a lot interesting about that documentary, and I would highly recommend you watch it. I don't endorse everything that's in that documentary, but it's certainly food for thought.
All right, we've got more questions coming in by text, and after this one, we'll go to Filson on this side, and then we'll jump back. Both of you said that feminism is inherently invalid and unnecessary in the Islamic community because the Quran is perfect and Allah's message is perfect, and it most certainly is. But Islam's blatant perfect contrasts deeply against our inherent flawed human nature, which leads to my question. Again, Nour stated that some Muslim women who agree with feminism do so because they themselves have faced hardship at the hands of abusive men, and that those men cannot generalize the entire Muslim community. Those men who abuse women in the name of Islam are still doing so, but one can't agree with their identity and then not give a reasonable approach with how to deal with it. What should we do to combat this? Why is feminism so inherently evil if it gives women a feeling like their suffering is valid? Men won't follow Islam perfectly, and some women will suffer from it. What then? If the feminist movement stops some men from abusing their women and in turn bringing them closer to their deen, is that in itself counterproductive? Sorry for the long post.
Was that a female? No? So the first question, if I remember, is what is the solution to human folly, despite the fact that our divine revelation is perfect? The solution is returning to Islam authentically. The era that we live in is a secular era. We are displaced individuals, and we have to understand that. The way that we're living our lives, be it living back home or if we're living here in the West, there is no sort of structure that is political that is committed to Islam right now, right? And I hate to use the word over and over again, but there is no Khalifa. And so without a Khalifa, you cannot enforce those rights that women have within our deen. So the logical thing, at least as far as I understand it, is we need to advocate and we need to understand that if our deen is perfect and a Khalifa has existed, for 1,300 years, and we didn't have these issues around women's rights and the question of feminism, as Daniel, has pointed out over and over again, then what are we missing? And it's this legitimate, authoritative sort of political structure that defends and safeguards our rights. That was the first question, right?
Yep.
Okay. Do you want to add anything?
No, I completely agree. I think that I agree. Feminism validates a certain female perspective and seemingly addresses grievances and abuse, but I think that it's a false promise. It's a false promise of safety and protection within the fold of feminism. I think feminism offers false solutions. Certainly, I mean, that was the whole point of what I was discussing, but let me give you more explicit examples. I think that the problem with Muslims adopting feminist language is that if you imbibe that ideology to solve a specific problem, then you might solve the specific problem, but you're going to cause 10 more problems, right? And the analogy that I use often is that if the taking away of women's rights, the violation of women's rights, if that's a disease, then feminism is like, or as a cancer, feminism is like chemotherapy, right? It's going to destroy you. It's going to cause all kinds of problems for you. It will take care of the cancer, but it'll take you to the brink of death in order to do so. Whereas if we look to Islam, if we look at what the classical tradition has said, what our scholars have said, what the Prophet, peace be upon him, has said, what the Quran, what Allah in his book says, properly understood and interpreted, that's the organic cure. That's the wholesome cure. That's going to solve the problem in a way that is holistic and addresses us as human beings within the context of our families and this aspiration to a family-centric society that I've been discussing. So as far as feminism is concerned, don't treat the problem with chemotherapy and this chemical, nasty ideology. Look for the wholesome, holistic, organic solution. And this is what you see, like if you look at, I published a short article recently on the grave implications of feminist Islam. And you can read this on my website, muslimskeptic.com, where I show how very basic feminist premises about the culpability of the patriarchy in oppressing women, if you accept that premise, then it'll take you down a very clear path to ultimately rejecting Islam. Because yes, we all start from this place of wanting to make sure that women are not abused and mistreated and that women are getting their rights, okay? And at that point, when we recognize the problem, that's where we have to opt for Islamic solutions, to put it very simply. If we opt for feminist solutions, then we have to take these assumptions about the patriarchy, about intersectionality, about mansplaining, and so on and so forth. You start thinking in those terms and looking at the world in that, according to that worldview and that paradigm, then Islam starts looking very barbaric. Okay, the classical scholars, which our faith depends on, because they're the ones who have transmitted Islam. Like, no one has a direct connection to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and what he said. His words and the Quran itself had to be transmitted, right? And what's the path of transmission? It's coming from this body of scholars. So if they're morally culpable and they're, these vile, misogynist, patriarchal people, you're taking, if you're calling yourself a Muslim, your religion is coming from those people. Okay, so think about the implications of that. But it doesn't stop there. You start viewing the Sahaba, the Salaf, as vile and patriarchal, misogynistic. You start reading about their lives. You start reading about their personal lives. You start reading about the kinds of things that they said. And this shouldn't be surprising, but a lot of what they say doesn't conform to what 21st century gender studies professors are teaching at Harvard and MIT and elsewhere. It shouldn't be a surprise. Why would it conform? So then you end up rejecting the Sahaba. Then the Prophet, what the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, has said. You read hadith, not just one, not just two, not just three, that will hit you right here. Will hit you right here. And I know because I considered myself a feminist. And I read these hadith, and they shocked me. And they offended me. And I had to do some soul searching. I had to think, okay, is this ideology of feminism correct, or is Islam correct? Because it can't be both, right? It can't be both, and you have to make a hard choice. And so what I did was research. Okay, I said, okay, feminism is making these claims that are putting the words of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and even the words of God in a bad light. Then okay, let me critically evaluate feminism, and that's what I did. And these are the kinds of conclusions that I'm sharing with you. But it doesn't stop there, because you can also look at the Quran. You can look at the words of God. God refers to himself as He. Okay, we know that Allah does not have a gender. Okay, nonetheless, He refers to Himself using masculine pronouns in the Arabic language. Okay, doesn't this contradict feminist equity and equality? Of course it does. So, are you going to discard the words of God, your creator? Or maybe you should think seriously about what gender studies professors have said for the past 5 years. I think for me, the choice is clear. And the fact that, all the prophets, all the Anbiya were men. There's some minority opinions that will say that there were, a couple of female prophets as well, but that's like a very rare minority opinion. But the majority opinion is that all the prophets were male. Okay, the last prophet, the greatest messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was a man. So how is that fair? Again, the feminist ideology, take it to its logical conclusion. Is God's preferring males over females by the last prophet being a man? So this is the path. This is the path to apostasy. And it's very, and you can see it very clearly. You can see it very clearly. I have family, I have friends, and they all have the same reasoning. It's a very clear, defined path. So be aware of it and protect yourself, okay? Because on the day where we stand before our Creator and He questions us, it's not going to be a good excuse to say, my professor in gender studies said so and such, or my friend, my social justice warrior friend said this and I took it for what it was. That's not going to be a valid excuse. So think critically. That's I think both of our messages tonight for you.
Okay, so after an hour and 15 minutes that we started with, we have 15 minutes left, and we have 5 new people that have not spoken yet. So I'd like to get everyone in at least once. So you can start.
So I guess as an adult woman who's grown up in the West and has believed herself to be Muslim and has followed some of this teaching, obviously I struggle with this I think this talk touched on some of the things that I've struggled with personally. And I think it's weird for me to say so in this kind but no, personally with the label of feminism, because feminism for me is always this Western feminism, and I've always believed in women's equity, which I think is 100% in line with Islamic values, and it's not the same necessarily, right? And we can point to a lot of things where women's equity was the most important moral of the story, so to speak. So I guess what I'm struggling a little bit with what you guys are saying, and I don't take it quite as far as you guys did, but I don't, and she touched on it with her question, is I don't understand if you're saying that feminism has, so first of all, I would argue that feminism, that patriarchy comes from this Western colonial position. It's part of the package. And I don't, it doesn't have to be this systemic thing, because but in the same way that one people have used certain reasoning to some degree other people, the reasoning, it follows, they used it to subjugate other parts of own people, right? So it exists, whether we call it patriarchy or consider it to be a systemic issue, or whether you consider it to not have it, for it to not have been there the whole of history, right? Like I would. So I guess my question is if feminism is this man-made theory, right, that's not the solution, why isn't patriarchy a man-made problem? Do you know what I mean? Like your argument is that Islam is the answer, not feminism, right? But Islam is also the answer to defeating this idea of patriarchy that men are better than women. And so, but it exists whether we like it or not, or call it that, right? The thing is there. So, why do you disavow patriarchy in that way? So I guess my question is
Before you answer, I'm gonna actually have to time you guys if you want to get through everybody. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Does that
totally.
make sense?
Yeah, totally. And thank you for providing context there. The perspective that I'm speaking from is, and I tried to put this as a disclaimer at the beginning, but I guess I didn't do a very good job, is we're not looking at the West and the West's history. We're looking at the Muslim world and its history, right? And so in that sense, up until the turn of the 20th century, we've always had, a political system in place that ascribes itself to Islam and the Quran and the Hadith. It's hard to argue that there was a patriarchy during that time because we're operating under different terms. Now, from my understanding from what you're saying is that in terms of the West's experience or history, one could make that argument that patriarchy exists or existed.
So my issue is that we already know that Islam brought women's equity to that part of the world when it came about, right? We already know that. There was drastic drops in, the infanticide of little girls and things like that. We already know that the problem was there, that women were considered lesser, and Islam solved it. So why do you not consider that that's an actual still problem?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
You don't have to call it that
say,
but it is. I mean, it was there before, and Islam fixed it. So.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Oh, that's, by the way, academically contested by feminists, just to put that out there.
What?
That pre-Islamic Arab women were oppressed and that Islam gave them their rights. Look at Layla Ahmed.
I'm not arguing whether or not that I'm a feminist or we should be a feminist or what feminist is as a whole. My question is about patriarchy because you specifically said that.
Yeah.
That's not a thing, right?
I think someone else asked a similar question. And again, to me, it goes back to where is the body of convincing literature that proves if patriarchy exists, that means it's a system, right? In order for it to be a system, it permeates every level of society, every level, from the micro to the macro. I have yet to read anything that aligns with Islam that proves that in a cogent fashion and in a coherent fashion.
But whether or not we consider...
I'll give this one more minute.
Sorry, yeah. Whether or not we consider all of what West calls patriarchy, right? Like, I'm not talking, about specifically...
Yeah, and I agree.
No,
you can call it whatever you want to call it.
But my point is, though, that, like, in our own Islamic history, right, we know certain things were faced by Islam. And those things were in existence during the Jahiliyyah time because people thought women were lesser, right? So if that, I mean, the proof, the stuff that you're saying, you've never read instances of this. It's in our own history, right? Maybe not all of the things that we're talking about.
I mean, this is...
When we say patriarchy, like wage gap or whatever you want to
all right.
Some of those
last points on each side.
Sorry. Good.
Did you want to say something?
If you have other points.
Go for it.
So this idea of Islam came and gave women their rights, it's true in some sense, but it's also a very modern interpretation of Muslims trying to put their history in a feminist light. So it's no surprise that if we take that narrative at face value and take it for granted, that it's going to justify feminism. Do you see the circle there?
I'm arguing for feminism.
Okay, so patriarchy. So the idea of patriarchy comes from the...
No, I'm saying that they're two separate things that bounce off of each other.
Okay.
They don't have to, like,
Okay, it seems like this is
I'll-
going to take longer, and I know you guys.
Yeah,
know
we can
each
just
other,
talk
so
in
we can move
person.
on. I'll just ask
Can I
that you
give a
three.
suggestion? Can you hear everyone's questions and then have the speakers address it? That way everyone can speak? Or...
I was going to ask them to actually ask all their questions at once. And then
Okay,
they
yeah,
can
that's
address
better.
them.
I've been waiting here for a bit.
Yeah, she's
Oh, I did not
aware.
know that you actually had a question. Then can the four of you actually all ask your questions?
I was here like first.
You were there first. I wasn't. I
Yeah,
did not
she
know that
wasn't
you were there as a questioner. If you could, if you could pass the mic down, okay, and all four of you could ask your questions. Our hosts that have actually been very gracious and came in at the last moment need us out of the room by 10 as an agreement with the university. So
9 minutes.
yeah.
Fine, so.
I came here to very open-minded. I want to build on our commonalities. One thing you guys talk about a lot is the lack of, accountability in the society, which is something I've noticed a profound amount of. I think that in order for people to feel accountable in a society, they have to feel as though they belong in that society. They have to feel as though they're a part of a community. And one thing that our community consistently does is turn people away. And I don't think you should look at feminism as an ideology. I think you should look at it more as a community. You have to wonder why people within your communities are leaving and going to other communities to get support. There are things that we cannot talk about in our communities because, quite frankly, sitting here and listening to this, it makes me not trust any of you. And I really wonder what you all are doing outside of this context with regard to advancing the protection of women. This, literally, I came here, and this isn't much different than your Twitter feed. This is like a battle of egos. Like, you're here to talk about something that you think is a logical fallacy. What are you really doing? This is literally, like, I've heard so much outright, terminology being thrown about, like, what are we really doing? What are we investing our time in? I'm really disappointed that I came here tonight. I could have been at a qiyam, to be honest with you, but I'm here listening to a Twitter conversation instead of us actually, making efforts and having actionable, thoughts. And I'm just really disappointed. I'm really disappointed, and I'm curious to know what you're doing to address the atrocities committed by men. What you're doing in your community to make people trust you. Because right now, you've just made a lot of people more distrusting of the Muslim community in general. That's pretty much what I have to say, but I'm sorry that all we can really build on is the lack of accountability in our communities.
If that's the question, can we have the other three tag on to that, and then they'll do their best to finish. And please try and keep it like brief, like 10 seconds. Sorry.
First of all, I'd like Myron for coming and talking in this.
Question, bro.
I need to make a comment, and we can talk about. I just want to make a comment because I think that just relates to the nature of the talk, and then we can talk about it later. So I think like these topics, like I'm just saying to myself as a reflection. I think it's important to make reflection sometimes, not to just like, oh, you said this, I did this, who said right, who said wrong. It's a good way to like learn and reflect, I think. I think it's a really, important topic, but also a very complicated topic. You mentioned nation state. It took me 2 years to understand what nation state is. I still don't think I have understood it properly. And probably it's going to take another 2 years to understand what family state is. And thanks for bringing it up. I'm definitely going to search and try to learn as I pursue my Islamic knowledge. So you brought a lot of, important topics that probably takes several years to understand, even to be able to reason about, to actually kind of have that discussion. So just my reflection as individually is that, you may have not understood some things. I wasn't sure if I understood some things. Not to me it's wrong or not rational, but I think that just should encourage us to try to learn more. ask more questions. Maybe that was your purpose. Like, I'm gonna just touch on all of your, things that.
Okay, I'm gonna cut you out in 10 seconds.
No, please.
You know very well how hard you work to get this space. We don't want to impose on our hosts.
Yeah,
there
so,
are two people,
yeah, you're
2 women behind you.
You're here. So I apologize. That's right. But just let me just get through my points. I think the rhetoric used is not easy to grasp, and I'm sure there's a reason, because a lot of people in our reactionary society, we are used to having these like big talks where we talk about information in 2 hours and we want to resolve it all, and like we say, yeah, I understand. It's not going to happen. It has not happened to me for me. I had to sit and say, okay, I need to learn about these things. I need to go to scholars who have jobs there and sit with them, learn with them in small circles. So this is my suggestion. Go, please do that. Otherwise, if you're frustrated, it's fun. It's possible you may have been frustrated for good or bad reason. And I think because these topics require so much chain of understanding, there are a lot of rational steps made that are really huge, that just on their own require at least an hour of discussion. So that just makes me question, is it even fruitful to have a discussion in this way? It's just like my reflection. Okay, I'm not saying this shouldn't have been in this way or whatever. I'm just reflecting on it to say maybe we should just take one part of it, talk about it 2 hours, another day, and move on. And I think, but there is at least one responsibility I think you guys have, which is that you should really when we talk about these issues, we also need to present well. I talk about patriarchy and all of these things. There is a list of 30 books you need to read, and you need to do all of these research to understand. Otherwise, I can really feel people's frustration. This is just my.
Efe, in the sake of fairness,
yeah.
Other people were not allowed to speak more than one question. Can you please wrap up your point, or that was your last point? Because there are 2 people who have still not spoken a single point.
These are one of the guys speaking for the questioner, so quality.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to make this quick. So thank you very much for that talk. You talked about how one person ends up having to make the decision earlier. And first of all, this goes against the idea of equitable, I think, that you talked about. And in a familial level, this is a husband or a father, as you pointed out. And in a political level, this is the male politicians, and particularly in today's context, a leader like Donald Trump, who openly subjugates women under a sexual right. And in a professional level, this is our bosses, who are predominantly men, and where in some cases women who achieve professional success are regarded as neglecting their domestic values, as desired by society. Whether or not that's true or not, that's sometimes how we see them. And in our educational level, our literatures are written by men, and sometimes purposefully. And which I think this addresses your whole rhetorical comment that, were women incompetent in history to voice their concerns, or your argument, Nour, that you said, where is the body of literature that states this claim? So that at every level, or at least let's say most levels, men are making their decisions. And I think this is exactly where mainstream feminism, at least in my understanding of feminism, the natural dialogue comes in. It's an outlet to give women a voice, an outlet to address their concerns, to voice their. I think this is also one of the things I shared earlier. And so then, should this outlet be denied? I can see that we can turn to our Muslim communities and we can turn to other communities and support families, but for people who don't have these communities, who are not in an enriched environment or family stature, I feel like these are the outlets that they look for, and I think maybe the feminism as a label for its historical context is not a very good thing, but feminism as what it does as an outlet for women to voice their concerns, I think that is a valid point. So then should that be denied in this other context?
All right, last one, and then really quick answer.
Should I go?
Yes, please.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for coming to speak today. So I'll keep it very brief. First question is, so you mentioned about muscle power, and you said, men, they are obviously biologically different from women, and so it makes sense that, for example, they can do certain things that women can't. But feminism, at least the first wave, occurred after the Industrial Revolution. So
mainstream feminism, as I understand it, is not totally concerned with muscle power, but more so with brain power. And I'm curious what you think about how the brain power of men and women differ and how feminism thinks of that. And then the second one, very brief, is you mentioned that women calling out like the patriarchy and calling out like the injustices and stuff was not really there in the past. But how do you justify that, given that the ratio of men to women scholars in the past has also been very imbalanced? Thank you.
Good questions.
It is 10:01. Pick and choose. And
We respond to one.
pick and choose if you want to do all very, very quickly or give one. Due respect. There, you're on Facebook, both of you.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think embedded in both of your questions, again, is, this question of denial of systemic power known as patriarchy for, all intents and purposes. So I'm not going to go into that because two people have already asked a similar question and I've responded. But I do want to answer, I'm sorry, your name? Zuqayla. Your first question, can you repeat it, please? Because it was a really good one.
I thought I only had one question, but the outlet being denied, is that...
Got it. So feminism as an outlet for women to rightly, voice their experiences, right? I have a question for you. We agree injustices are faced by women. Then, now, probably, for sure, tomorrow. Yeah? Do you identify as a Muslim?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. Why did you turn to feminism as opposed to holding your community accountable to what Islam says? Your community is messing up, doesn't have, the people that need to be there. Why aren't you exerting energy in fixing that versus turning to an ideology whose roots are inherently designed to overthrow your faith?
So this is exactly what I was saying.
Yeah.
As to, I was not raised up in a very Islamic or that type of context. And if you are born in a context where you're not surrounded by family members who are Islamically knowledgeable or things like that, you don't have that context. Therefore, you are turned into whatever.
How old are you?
Wow, funny. Sorry.
So you're, at the tail end of being a millennial.
Yeah.
There's no excuse. There's information everywhere. Technology makes information available. I mean, people literally convert to different religions just by watching YouTube. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm not ever invalidating any woman's experiences. In fact, if we were to sit down and have coffee or tea together, you'd probably be shocked to hear some of the experiences I've gone through as a woman. And you would think, why aren't you a feminist, right? So not having exposure or access to certain resources in this day and age is an excuse, in my humble opinion, right? If you want truth, if you want answers, if you want justice, you go out and you get it. Feminists fight tooth and nail. They're out in rallies, they're protesting, they're working hard. So we as identifying Muslims can't scour the internet to find a community that is supportive? Doesn't make any sense. So my question to your question is, why that route and not this route?
And so I'll address Efe's point about, yes, the argument that I gave in my presentation, it required a lot of substantiation, and you can't really give substantiation in just 45 minutes or an hour. But I've written a lot on this subject. If you want to read more about my views on feminism and my critiques, go to my website, muslimskeptic.com. You can also follow my page, Facebook page and Twitter, my last name, Haqiqatjou, and then also on muslimskeptic.com I have a reading list of certain books that I recommend on feminism.
It's not enough, by the way. It's not enough. I appreciate everything, but please
provide more resources, because I think it's a responsibility, and I don't think as one scholar, let's assume you are the best scholar, just for a second, you have to judge everything. That still does not mean everything you wrote is going to be enough. That's just my point. Because these are
what I'm writing about doesn't require ijazat. I'm speaking as someone who has studied the Western tradition. Everything that I argue off of is based on established views, either daruri or ijma'. I'm not like trying to give fatwa, or I'm not doing my own ijtihad. Any Muslim can enjoin the good and forbid the evil, and that's a responsibility of all Muslims, and that's the capacity in which I write and I speak on. So, with all due respect, please go read, my work on this and see what references I have. I'm also teaching a class, winter intensive, inshallah, in December in Pennsylvania, or in New Jersey actually, and we have an entire unit dedicated to feminism and critiquing feminism.
All right. Jazakallah khair. Thank you everybody for coming.